Alright, good evening everyone. We are now going into our final AE tune-up stream for the bots of the 2MK group. This content will be rebroadcast from my Rillian 2_MK channel to the main 2_MK channel of the team with my full permission. So we've covered nearly every bot that we actually use on a regular basis in the previous episodes of this, and we're now finishing it up. There are 4 more to go, not counting Nikali, who does not have anything related to any of this, but you can look forward to KolinBot 2.0, which probably will have at least something. So we're not actually covering Nikali, but let's push on through with the 4 remaining bots. And we'll start with the most recent.
Allow me a moment to entertain you.
Now, Zeku isn't really something one needs to look through. ZekuBot originally had more effort put into making his V-trigger usable. And eventually we decided, you know, this just isn't working out usefully enough to make this something the bot needs to have as a focus. So you shouldn't really expect too much of anything in there. In fact, functionally, he should have nothing whatsoever. There are spaces we could have put his V-trigger, but he shouldn't have any functionality for it.
Don't waste your breath.
The settings for his gauges are unlike most bots, and you do actually only use his health in the auto recover state. Whereas from my side, as the player, I also only get normal duration on both my V-timer and normal on my critical gauge. However, I do get auto recover on my V gauge. So moving from there, we're looking into what changes there might have been that will make ZekuBot act differently. But obviously, as he's a character who doesn't really have many changes in the AE patch notes, we're generally expecting that basically nothing's changed for him either. Therefore, all we care about here is to make sure that nothing unintended or strange has happened as a result of AE being released. Now, the thing you're supposed to try to do against ZekuBot is mostly dealing with his overhead and his slide. He also has some Bushin flip stuff that you are better off dealing with. But you're supposed to defend against that, and functionally defend against one of those, even though that's not actually a move that you get points for. He's here to mostly help you understand Zeku's frame data and help you deal with the matchup. But as you can see, he doesn't have any activation points for his V-trigger at all. Your aim, therefore, which is probably not so easily demonstrated on ChunLi, or at least the difficulty of it, is hitting him with your longest normals. Because he's generally trying to push you out, but unlike most zoners who can control that space entirely, with Zeku you can definitely be sure you will get at least fairly close before he has to do something. You can't rush in on him, but you do have a little time to get yourself close enough to cause him some problems. And that's it. All you really have to do is to get points, is hit stuff like that. If your character does not have quite as long a normal as Chun-Li's standing heavy punch, of course, it may not be that easy. The main thing that the bot is supposed to do is cause you to think about the spacings you stand in and your opponent's many options from those positions. Note that the specific requirement is that you punish him from basically neutral. And by that we mean you had to not be blocking before you did the move. This is actually slightly difficult because he spends so much time generally moving and spaces himself in ways that make it somewhat difficult if you're not used to the character. And the reason for the requirement that you do it with your longest normal is not only that your longest normal tends to be your slowest, but simply that thinking about how far away you can stand from him is important. And of course, to get the points you must actually connect and do damage. Now obviously you can try jumping at him and doing it instead, but since your longest normal tends to be slow, there's no real restriction on being able to hit it from close range. If you can get close enough and not get yourself killed while doing it, fine. But once again, you can't be blocking, and it can't, effectively it can't be meaty. You can't have knocked him down. You and Zeku have to be more or less dancing around in neutral like this. And then you get your hit. And he has a lot of ways to interrupt that. Command normals are also involved in this, so for example in Chun-Li's case I'm using the stand heavy punch because it's relatively easy. Her stand heavy kick would also work, but is not really her longest. Her longest command normals are basically her forward heavy kick and this, which is actually relatively easy to hit with. But you can still see some spacings there. So for this I have chosen to use her stand heavy punch. And this move. So just to see how Zeku functions, I'll be trying to do that more. I'm looking for the opening in which I can pull this off. And it's perfectly fine to figure out ways to get him away from me, so that I can set it up. Which gives you a bot that you're actually allowed to beat up for once. As long as you let him get back to neutral after you've done it. That, for example, does not count. That was basically a punish. By the time you've recognized that Zeku has given you such an opening, he's probably closed the opening. Much like this. And again, that's functionally a punish. Although that one you still get the point for because you are coming in after he's already executed the move, which is fine. The idea is to get yourself to stand at a particular spot, and from that particular spot, do your damage. He also has a somewhat deceptive frontal hitbox, which also does not help the matter. You do get points if Zeku happens to be running at you in young form when he does things. Because again, if it's your longest normal, it's probably that you already made that decision, and in the rail game you could get that experience where it is time to do that because you expect him to run. This is especially useful against young Zeku, who does better if he does run at those ranges. After he's faded you out a little bit, of course. But you will learn a lot about Zeku's hitboxes and hurtboxes this way. Certain things he pulls back, and certain other things that you can use to get extra damage without worrying too much about it. And besides that, all you have to do really is defend, which is in itself a chore, really. There again we have that deceptive backward hitbox. This bot is one that is mostly for matchup, and as you play him more and more, it becomes easier not just through execution but through realizing where you're standing. So, I wouldn't think it's a bot you need to repeat every so often, except if you get into a match with Zeku and realize, oh, I'm whiffing everything. You can choose whether or not to give yourself points based on reacting to him after he runs. Begins running, that is. He does have moves that he will do out of the run, so if you choose to do it that way, you could just sometimes lose regardless. But here is the general way that this flows. You're trying to get in on him, and little or nothing has changed about this bot as a result of the Season 3 changes. So given that, let's move on to a bot that has changed a very large amount in comparison. And one where we will actually need to show off the second V-trigger. So, let's review what Kolin's V-trigger actually allows her to do in V-trigger 1 for our bot. And of course, the actual requirements of the bot. Kolin is similar to Zeku in that she's mostly about understanding hitboxes and hurtboxes, but she, unlike Zeku, gets more meter. Technically, I am allowed to set these gauges to whatever I want, but I will leave it as they were for Zeku and move forward from there. Now, because of Kolin's changes, she's slightly more negative on the V-skill, which is one of the parts of the bot you're supposed to use to get points. You're supposed to punish her V-skill. Fortunately though, she doesn't use her V-skill that much. That's the other part of the bot. You are supposed to try to hit Kolin with your cross-ups. So for example, that is basically a point. And if you're familiar with Kolin's V trigger, it basically is mostly just a combo extender that pushes the player back and can OTG if they're in a particular space, but that's about it. You'll notice that of course she moves out of the way of cross-ups fairly often, and if your cross-up buttons are not so good, then you end up hitting her but you don't get the cross-up. And noting which of those things has happened can throw you off, depending on which way you do your move. So she's good for that as well. She's generally a tricky bot who spends a lot of time doing things that you have to mentally get used to. It's not specifically hard to defend against her if your aim is to defend, but as soon as you start trying to move and do what the requirements of the bot say, you have a bit more effort to put in. This is partially because Kolin's hurt boxes move in particular ways while she's doing her moves that tend to change whether or not you can cross her up. And she spends enough time off the ground, or generally in motion, that if you decide to just do it by putting her into a bad situation and then trying, there's not a true string from most characters that will make sure you can do that successfully. The other thing you're supposed to do is deal with that move, but you must combo Kolin when she does that move. This is a different matter than managing to throw her or similar. Most characters have some buttons that move them forward enough that even if she does the EX tail, you can get your combo off, but it's usually only one such button. So you do have to learn it. It's usually not as simple as, okay, I'm hitting her, because the hail will come out regardless of whether or not you have made contact, unlike the regular hail, and it will often interrupt your combo. And if you are in the wrong position when she does that, you really have no way out. Also notably, you don't get points there if you react to her doing her counter by, her EX counter, by jumping. But as you've seen so far, basically she just occasionally cancels into her the trigger and does some damage. However, pinning her down long enough to get your cross-up combos is a different matter altogether. As you can see from Parabellum as well, again, depending on your character's cross-up button, she may simply not be in the position you'd expect. And repositioning yourself so that you can get the cross-up is very likely to lead to stress. And that is the final way you can get points. You are supposed to be reversal when she does that cancel. This is actually fairly important to understand how to do in that matchup. And of course, therefore, you can raise the difficulty of this by not having the meter to do it with. Generally, it's perfectly fine to finish one combo and immediately go into another one if she was standing. In most of our findings, she has enough ways of making sure that you are not in the right position to hit her with stuff. That is fine. And depending on your timing, you could just be unlucky and get countered, even if you try to do it easy. So though we don't suggest it, there's no specific reason why that's a terrible thing to allow yourself to have points for. But once again, for the most part, you're not seeing a lot of difference in terms of what she's able to do when her V-trigger is active versus when it's not. But with her new Absolute Zero, Kolin probably changes the most out of every character that has been changed in our bot stable. The smallest change, of course, is that her punches get a bit more dangerous. And the second change is that her hailstorms get much bigger. Another thing you cannot easily see is that her dash has changed to have some we'll call it invulnerability for now. And she's able to move in ways that she could not move before, even though on the bot they're very hard to notice. So you can't over-focus on basically getting the cross-ups all the time. Once the V-trigger runs out, which does not tend to take too long, you can go back to normal. But as I said, the main problem here is pinning her down long enough to get anything in that situation. The rest of the character doesn't really change that much, as the bot was never given any of Kolin's stronger approach mix-ups. And certainly nothing that specifically interacts with the new V-trigger. As you can see, there are a lot of times where she's simply getting out of the way of my attacks. And often when she doesn't actually get out of the way, then the reason she hasn't gotten out of the way is because it forced me to hit from the front. Which, depending on what you're doing and which character you're playing, can actually be a problem for you. For example, in my case, training with her is mostly about training to get myself to do the correct combo based on which side I land on. ChunLi's combos are not specifically complicated and you do have quite a lot of time to do it. But if you aren't heavily trained in how to do that, which is what the bot is for, you can drop your jump-in cross-up combos simply by having the type of combo that acts differently depending on which side you're on, and then having to recognize that in a very short space of time. All the while dealing with various Kolin pressure. And you also do not get any points for air reset, nor ambiguous cross-ups, per se. Although it would help if your ambiguous cross-up was controllable by you, and if so, you should be able to do it so that it always crosses up. And that's just another level of training. If you know a way to make your cross-up ambiguous, but you have some control over which side you end up on, well, the idea here is to always make sure to end up on the side that actually gives you the cross-up on the screen. ChunLi is a generally good example of this because if your muscle memory tells you do this combo this way when you're on this side of the screen or in a cross-up or whatever situation, unless you're holding straight down, which I probably should train to do, that can happen to you. You will end up doing her command normal instead of this part of the combo and having to recognize midway, oh wait, I did the combo wrong because I didn't quickly recognize which side I was on. This is not particularly hard to do, but you definitely can be taken off guard by it. And the same thing goes for characters who have, more importantly, command normals that are the second hit of their combo. So if I wanted to do those, then I care which side I'm on, a lot. So therefore, while it feels like it would be fairly easy to make sure you know where you're ending up when you jump, for Kolin this is actually probably the most challenging it gets for any given character at the moment. And since you cannot easily jump over her with her tendency to just hit stand heavy punch and neutral like that, it can become a problem. Now, as you can see, the bot doesn't necessarily use her V-trigger that often though, especially if you're performing well, you get less and less V-trigger actually. But it's her high evasion ability that will make this difficult to do even in the best days. Meanwhile, trying to stay conscious enough of everything else going on to get those points if you need them. And as you get higher up into the bot's difficulty, the B skill stops giving any points at all, so you're putting a lot of effort into making sure you get this done. There's also a situation where, because of how Kolin moves, if you are doing something you expect to be a jump forward, but she is in a particular situation, the game can make it feel as if you were jumping back. And unless your character has a clear animation difference between those two things, or you are, for example, not the type who watches your own character while doing jumps, it can throw you off guard a little bit. So as you can see, you can't just decide, okay, I'm jumping over you now, everything's fine. Because at the range where you can easily be sure that you will clear over her heavy punch, she can easily do another move and make you whiff entirely, for many characters. This bot is not so much about teaching you to get into the position to do the cross-up, but rather, because she moves so much that you don't really have time for that, it's more so about making you able to recognize when you are already in that position. and when it's basically a good time to jump. Generally, much like Ed in his dash throw situation, if Kolin has stood still long enough for you to really have a lot of time to recognize that situation, most likely at that moment if you jump, she will no longer be in there. Your best chances are her standing still for a little bit and then throwing Hailstorm. And this also affects your character, or is affected by character, because some characters jump forward and easily evade the Hailstorm as it comes down, even if they jump relatively late. Chun-Li and Zeku, for example, move out of the way of Hailstorms fairly easily. For Alex and Zangief, for example, it's a bit harder. And of course, obviously, the fact that her tail gets bigger in V-Trigger does affect this. But as noted, she generally doesn't activate too often if you are succeeding, because you get more combos. And the chances of a stray hit that coincides with when she would activate her trigger are much smaller. However, once the V-Trigger is active, as you can see, it does not exactly run out very fast. And whenever she does do a move that reduces it, that's usually where your best options for anything are. And it becomes an issue to you. The bot does not have the moves that tend to use up the meter. So, things work out fine in that regard most of the time. So for Kolin, you can assume that the bot can be used in basically the same way. But if you change her to V-Trigger 2, you might get a little more experience at just looking at the stuff it does. It does not cover the very strong mix-ups that you are going to have to get used to. But it does have a couple things that might at least let you recognize what's happening sometimes. And now the final bot from my side of the stream before we go over to Just Vine on the main 2MK channel to finish up with Alex is the mirror match. Chun-Li is our most complex bot to put in, and not really the most complex or difficult of the advanced bots to fight, but the one that you'd use to test whether or not you've learned everything else. So fighting ChunLiBot is much simpler in terms of how exactly you should be taking her on than other things. Both your gauges should be at normal and her gauges can be at full. Dealing damage to this bot is relatively easy. This version is slightly different than the one on our site because I needed to change one thing about it. But it still mostly stands, especially with characters who have different crush counters now. Changes to Chun-Li are not really part of this bot. The combo that she uses for this would have worked either way. And giving her a better one didn't seem necessary. So your main aim is to do a throw when it comes to EX leg, and a full punish on that move. Which often is easy, depending on your character. But because of the way that EX Bird works, the range that you have to be at for it to be an unsafe thing, like fully unsafe, and get maximum damage, you may find that you don't really recognize this too easily depending on your character. And that moment of hesitation when you aren't sure whether or not you've made it right, or that you're not necessarily in the right range for the full punish you were hoping for, depending on your character, that can make you drop the combo. But you can mostly defend because she does not tend to put a lot of pressure on you otherwise. In fact, mostly just blocking is enough. However, she is a bot that is capable of draining your health primarily through white life damage because she doesn't generally stop attacking. Therefore, if you flinch, especially if you flinch while trying to reposition yourself to make sure you get your proper punish without having to get stuck in things, you might have a problem. However, for most of us, the aim is to stand as close as possible so we can crush counter that properly. And that just means that our only problem should be when we were trying to get in on her. However, if you're not aware exactly where you're standing and how much of that move hits you, can also determine how much damage you take from it. And therefore how much damage you are able to dish back out because the spacing changes. She does have that one mix up, but it's not usually anything that anyone can't respond to. If you are familiar with the character, you will generally be ready for the split kick when it happens. Generally, she does not gain that much from this V-trigger at all, as it's mostly meant for use by people who are very familiar with the character and just cancel out of one combo to get something else. You can also use the bot to figure out if you can do certain punishes from certain spaces when she does other moves. And that can improve your damage at least a little bit. You can also increase your own difficulty by forcing yourself to use meter for those punishes. And work on understanding the capacities of your own max damage crush counter combo for crush counters where you don't have as much time to think about it. The last point is for managing to punish her when she does EX legs at you. But you must throw her first. She can tech this throw, but generally she will not get out of the way of it. Because the throw is not where you get the point. You get the point from doing the meaty. Now, in the Season 3, you may need to change that somewhat because Forward throws generally leave you further away from the opponent. And she is a bot who is specifically has the capacity to quick rise and to back roll, but of course for throws there's only one thing that actually ever happens. So she does have multiple inputs that allow her to do the quick rise off of the throw, but she's not super likely to do it. She will only do it probably about half the time. So you still have to get used to the idea of an opponent who takes the throw and stays down versus the opponent that immediately gets up. The final point here is for anti-airs, but as you can see, she generally doesn't jump that often, and when she does, it's often that you're standing in this defense space. And are trying to anti-air that move in itself, her air legs. The final point is for taking no damage during her B trigger, which will obviously be changed, but can actually be used if you are waiting for us to come up with a new method. You don't actually have to change that too much, and I'll demonstrate that by changing her to her V trigger too. What this opens up for her generally is just one extra space in which she has an option that can change the spacing between you. We're not going for her long setups in terms of that becoming an unblockable move or any of those things. She just occasionally does Kikosho and that pushes you backwards. However, Kikosho is relatively plus, and you can learn about this more through experiencing the bot. It's not so plus that you can't do anything, but there's nothing you would do at the range that she ends up at that wouldn't then lose to something right afterwards, and you therefore have to learn not to do that to yourself. She's a relatively tricky character in terms of being able to get you to think it's okay to hit the button now, and then use one of her rarer options to counter your attempt to do that. And of course things like that. Since she has the maximum number of options after the Kikosho, and can charge while she's doing it, you could just be unlucky enough that, despite the fact that you hit the technically correct button, she ends up doing spinning birds instead. Or that. There are any number of things that can become difficult as soon as you don't fully recognize where you are on the screen after her use of that move. The easy answer, of course, is to not punish it at all, but I'm sure none of us want to leave an opposing character with a completely free version of how to deal with themselves. Especially one that is charged and can be charged to be unblockable if you happened to wait really long until it was over. She also has other good options, like a ton of moves that are better done when she's at that spacing, and it can't really be dealt with because she's there. And therefore the bot benefits quite a lot from changing to this V-trigger without too much loss in terms of what it was normally doing before that the V-trigger 1 granted it. Especially since the hardest point system is based purely around the same crush counter of the spinning bird. And the anti-airs. But in this case, she basically only does 2 types of jump, i.e. Rankaku and Air Life itself. This can be fairly hard to do if you're not too familiar with how to deal with her moves. Or you don't have the reactions to do it. That move, for example, is almost unreactable if you are in the range that it could hit you. Which is often where the bot is intended to be. You're not going to get very far just trying to deal with it that way. And for those of you who have very directional anti-airs, you can use your new changes in AE to test them, because you can definitely now hit a lot more often with things that would probably have missed before. When she Rankakus and sails over your head. But you can also still be taken by surprise, especially if your character is not the type that has a very good directional anti-air or one that covers a lot of space. She can often get over your head before that even happens. And then you're dealing with either the cross-up or the head stomp or something of that nature. Not to mention, of course, that she can do the cross-up on her own. So it's of course very tempting to just block the entire time, because that's how it's functionally easiest to get the points. Which is probably why the hard version involves doing this without actually having that part. But you are waiting for her to do the EX bird as much as possible so that you can get that point at least, since that is the point that is available to you for basically all of them. So let's mostly try that. She can throw at least, so you do have to worry at least a little bit about it. And that point goes away pretty fast. So if your reasoning is, okay, I'll just wait and block, it isn't really that you can't beat the bot, but rather that whether or not you do so, and that was not a punish of that move, for example, has a lot more to do with what she randomly happens to do than anything else. But you can watch the health basically drift away. And you basically just can't block forever. As a generality, she will whittle you down completely. And while you can therefore just win by doing this, it's very much like in a real match where you don't know exactly what to do, but your opponent happens to do enough things that you know how to deal with that you win or lose. So if that is your strategy for the bot, I definitely wouldn't say it's a bad one, especially if you play defensive characters. But you should make sure that you can do that consistently, that you can defend so well, or that your character has so much health that it doesn't matter, and you can get away from them in those situations. Because running very far away from her in order to do certain things will prevent you from getting the points. And since the damage she does is normally special moves and not like most things where you are being hit by the character's large normals and taking a lot of white life damage that you could then run away and avoid completely until it came back, like that. A lot of what ChunLi hits you with is actually chip damage. It's partly why those moves are not allowed to be safe, because you could really just whittle someone down entirely based on them. After all that, I barely have lost any actual white health, gray health. It's just chipping away. So, regardless of anything else, you have a time limit. That is more or less tied to how often you can luck out with the random generator and land this sort of combo. And depending on the range and how your combo requires you to stand, you may not even make it. Therefore, that brings us to the end of the 3 bots that I will be covering today. And we'll be right back with the final bot of the evening, Just Fine and Alex.